Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The issue we're analyzing today is the Western Allies' policy of unconditional surrender in World War II. In this episode, when I'm referring to the Western Allies, that means the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. The Axis powers refers to Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. Most people have heard that term, Axis powers, but they might not know where it came from. In 1936, Benito Mussolini signed a treaty with Adolf Hitler and announced that Europe would henceforth rotate on the Rome-Berlin axis. From January 14 to 24, 1943, a conference was held in Casablanca, Morocco. This was a meeting between American President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, along with their entourages. Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin was invited but did not attend. Morocco was still an area of active combat operations. The Western Allies had invaded Northwest Africa on November 8, 1942 in Operation Torch. By the way, my father was a member of the American Army and was fighting in North Africa at that time. For years now, I've worn my father's World War II Army dog tag, and I'm wearing it right now. I recently went to Egypt on vacation with my wife and our two grown kids. As always, I was wearing my dad's dog tag. It was the first time that dog tag was back on the continent of Africa since 1943. At the time I'm recording this episode, that's 81 years. Getting back to the Casablanca Conference. This was the first time an American president was in a war zone since the U.S. Civil War. Certainly, Roosevelt and Churchill were not in any real danger, but this was still a war zone. Abraham Lincoln was in war zones several times during the American Civil War. Most famously, on July 12, 1864, he went to Fort Stevens in Washington, D.C. when the capital was being attacked by Confederate forces led by General Jubal Early. Lincoln was standing up looking over the parapet of Fort Stevens when Confederate bullets were being shot at the fort. Fun fact, this is the only time in American history when a sitting American president was under direct enemy fire. As Lincoln was standing there, staring out towards the Confederate lines, a young Union officer from Massachusetts named Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. yelled at Lincoln, "Get down, you damn fool!" Lincoln listened and got out of the line of fire. If the name of that Union officer sounds familiar, it's because Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. would later go on to be one of the most famous justices in the history of the United States Supreme Court. He served on the Supreme Court from 1902 to 1932. You can visit what remains of Fort Stevens in Washington, D.C. today. I've been there. There's not that much to see, mostly mounds of dirt with some small walls defining the fort. But I still recommend going if you are in D.C. It's a very overlooked place with all of the other famous places to see in Washington. And maybe you are like me and you just love to physically be in a place where history occurred. I am lucky that my wife placates me and goes with me to locations like this. I just find it incredibly cool to be standing there, thinking that our greatest president was calmly looking out towards the enemy while under fire during the greatest crisis in the history of the United States. Getting back to the Casablanca Conference. The purpose of the conference was for FDR and Churchill to determine the Western Allies' military strategy for 1943. For the U.S., most of 1942 had been spent mobilizing for war. Pearl Harbor had occurred in December of 1941. America had been at peace at that time and now had to convert its massive industries into production of tanks, planes, ships, and all other materials of war. And the small peacetime military forces had to be greatly increased. But there had been some significant gains in 1942. As I mentioned earlier, the Western Allies were now taking the fight to the Germans with the invasion of Northwest Africa in November 1942. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway occurred in June 1942, resulting in the U.S. Navy sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. After Midway, the Japanese were always on the defensive in the Pacific. And on August 7, 1942, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. U.S. Marines and Army soldiers, supported by the Navy, would endure an incredible fight over this strategic island until the Japanese evacuated their remaining forces in February 1943. So when Roosevelt and Churchill met at Casablanca in January 1943, they were deciding overall strategy for the upcoming year. On January 24, 1943, the final day of the Casablanca Conference, Roosevelt announced to reporters that he and Churchill had agreed that the best way to ensure a lasting peace was a policy of unconditional surrender by the Axis powers. In the middle of the press conference, FDR said, "I think we have all had it in our hearts and heads before, but I don't think that it has ever been put down on paper by the Prime Minister and myself, and that is the determination that peace can come to the world only by the total elimination of German and Japanese war power." Shortly thereafter, Roosevelt said, "The elimination of German, Japanese, and Italian war power means the unconditional surrender by Germany, Italy, and Japan. That means a reasonable assurance of future world peace. It does not mean the destruction of the population of Germany, Italy, or Japan, but it does mean the destruction of the philosophies in those countries which are based on conquest and the subjugation of other people." Churchill told the reporters, "I agree with everything that the president has said." Sometimes you read that Roosevelt announced this policy unilaterally without consulting Churchill. Not true. The Americans and the British had discussed unconditional surrender long before this announcement to the press. The policy of demanding unconditional surrender from the Axis powers had been considered by the Americans and British since the spring of 1942. Roosevelt and Churchill had previous meetings before the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. The first meeting occurred in August 1941, which was 4 months before Pearl Harbor. They met on August 9 and 10 aboard the USS Augusta in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland, Canada. A few days later, Roosevelt and Churchill released a joint declaration which is known as the Atlantic Charter. Even though the U.S. was not even in the war yet, the Atlantic Charter listed common principles that the U.S. and the U.K. were committed to supporting in the post-war world. They were looking ahead to the defeat of the Axis. America and Britain were committing themselves not to seek any territorial expansion as a result of the war and to restoring self-governments of the countries that had been conquered by the Axis. The next time that Churchill and Roosevelt met was right after Pearl Harbor. Churchill came to Washington, D.C. in December 1941 and stayed until January 1942. During that visit, Churchill stayed at the White House. There's a famous story that Roosevelt went down to Churchill's room in the White House. Churchill was getting out of the bathtub. Roosevelt apologized and turned his wheelchair around to leave. Churchill continued getting out of the tub and said, "The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to conceal from the President of the United States." There are arguments to this day as to whether or not this really happened. I certainly hope it did because I find it hilarious. And it does sound like something that Churchill would do and say. Roosevelt and Churchill became very good friends. The close relationship between those two leaders greatly assisted in probably the most effective military alliance in the history of the world. From January 1943 at the Casablanca Conference through the end of the war, unconditional surrender was the policy of the Western Allies. There are people who claim that unconditional surrender was a bad policy because it kept the Axis forces fighting until the bitter end. Not true. As I will explain, the policy of unconditional surrender did not cause either Germany or Japan to continue fighting. I'll discuss Germany and Japan in a little bit. But first, let's discuss the weakest of the Axis powers, Italy. Unconditional surrender was a non-factor in the war against fascist Italy. Only 6 months after the policy of unconditional surrender was announced at the Casablanca Conference, the Western Allies invaded Sicily in Operation Husky on July 10, 1943. Most of the civilians of Sicily welcomed the Western Allies as liberators. On July 19, 1943, the Allies bombed Rome for the first time. At this point, most Italians had had it with Benito Mussolini. They wanted to make peace with the Western Allies. They weren't concerned about unconditional surrender. Actually, Italians wanted to be occupied by the Western Allies to keep the Germans from running their country. But they did realize that they would have to get rid of Mussolini before they could surrender to the Western Allies. On July 24, 1943, Mussolini had a meeting with the Fascist Grand Council. Amazingly, the Grand Council voted Mussolini out of office. This vote did not have any real effect. However, the next day, King Vittorio Emanuele III, or in English, King Victor Emmanuel III, asked Mussolini to come see him at the royal palace. Yeah, most people don't realize that Italy had a king at that time. The king was essentially powerless. Mussolini had taken power in 1922, over a decade before his buddy Hitler came to power in Germany. During those almost 21 years that Mussolini had been in power, Victor Emmanuel III was the king, but had no real authority. Bolstered by the vote of the Fascist Grand Council, the king felt that he could now challenge Mussolini and told him that he was no longer prime minister. That's another thing that usually surprises people about Mussolini. His actual job description was prime minister. Of course, in reality, he was a dictator and went by the title Il Duce, which in Italian means the leader. The king was well prepared for this meeting with Mussolini and had a large contingent of carabinieri present to arrest him. The carabinieri were and are like a national police force in Italy. The removal from office and arrest of Mussolini did not trigger any revolts or protests by the people of Italy, not even the fascists. With the fall of Sicily and the bombing of the Italian mainland, Mussolini was very unpopular. The king appointed Italian Army Marshal Pietro Badoglio as the prime minister. The Italian government then engaged in secret negotiations with the Western Allies to surrender. They were fine with unconditional surrender to the Americans, British, and Canadians. People usually just talk about the Americans and British in the Italian campaign, but the Canadians also played a vital role. The surrender of Italy to the Western Allies was announced on September 8, 1943, by Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower. Unfortunately for the Italians, Hitler did not approve. There were already German troops in Italy. The Wehrmacht, the German army, took control of most of Italy. In early September 1943, the Western Allies invaded southern Italy. The Allies began pushing up the Italian peninsula. This resulted in fierce fighting through 1943, 1944, and into the spring of 1945. The fighting was now between the Western Allies and the Germans. I'm sure you're dying to know, what became of Benito Mussolini? After his arrest, the Italian authorities moved Mussolini around a few times. Finally, Mussolini was imprisoned at Campo Imperatore, which in Italian means Emperor's Field, a mountain resort in central Italy. If someone devoid of all humanity, like Adolf Hitler, could be said to have had one friend in the world, it was Mussolini. Hitler sent a rescue operation. On September 12, 1943, Mussolini was rescued by German paratroopers and eventually brought back to Germany. Hitler reinstated Mussolini as the figurehead leader of Italy. In reality, Italy was controlled by the Germans in the north and the Allies in the south. At the end of the war, Mussolini tried to escape to Switzerland with his longtime mistress, Clara Petacci. On April 27, 1945, Italian partisans stopped the small convoy containing Mussolini and his mistress near Lake Como. And although he was in disguise, the partisans recognized Il Duce. The next day, the partisans shot Mussolini and his mistress. The following day, the two were then hanged by their feet in the Piazzale Loreto, a square in Milan, so the public could spit on and physically abuse the bodies of their late dictator and his girlfriend. This was one time when the wife who was being cheated on got the better end of the deal. Mussolini's wife, Rachele, survived the war and was not shot by Italian partisans like his mistress was. In fact, Rachele lived to be 89 years old and died in 1979. In case you're wondering about the King of Italy, he physically survived the war but was thrown out of office shortly thereafter. The House of Savoy reigned over Italy for 85 years, starting when Italy was unified in 1861. But after World War II, the Italian people were not too fond of Victor Emmanuel III. They remembered how he enabled Mussolini to rule as dictator beginning in October 1922. To try to save the monarchy, the king abdicated in favor of his son, Prince of Piedmont Umberto II. It didn't work. In June of 1946, a referendum was held and Italians voted for a republic and ended the monarchy. Victor Emmanuel III was the last king of Italy. In America, Franklin Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage on April 12, 1945. His vice president, Harry Truman, was now the President of the United States. On April 16, 1945, Truman gave his first address to Congress as president. The key passage of that speech relating to today's topic was when Truman reaffirmed unconditional surrender.
So that there can be no possible misunderstanding, both Germany and Japan can be certain, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that America will continue the fight for freedom until no vestige of resistance remains. We are deeply conscious of the fact that much hard fighting is still ahead of us. Having to pay such a heavy price to make complete victory certain, America will never become a party to any plan for partial victory. To settle for merely another temporary respite would surely jeopardize the future security of all the world. Our demand has been, and it remains, unconditional surrender.
Before I get into my arguments as to why I believe unconditional surrender was a good and absolutely necessary policy, let's discuss why the Western Allies announced it in the first place. It mainly came from an opinion that the armistice and then the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, directly led to World War II. In November 1918, an armistice was reached between Germany on one side, and on the other side, the French, British, Americans, and the British Commonwealth troops, meaning Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India. An armistice is not an official end of a war. It simply means that both sides stopped fighting. The fighting stopped at 11 o'clock a.m. on November 11, 1918. They picked this because it was the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. A peace treaty between Germany and the Western Allies was not signed until June 28, 1919. By coincidence, that was exactly 5 years since Gavrilo Princip shot Archduke Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo, which was the proximate cause of World War I. The treaty was signed in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. That's why it's called the Treaty of Versailles. During World War I, Germany, along with its allies, had been fighting a two-front war. On the Eastern Front, Germany and its allies were fighting Russia. But due to the Communist Revolution in the fall of 1917, Russia had made a separate peace with the Central Powers. By the fall of 1918, Germany was only fighting the Western Allies. The problem with the armistice and the Treaty of Versailles is that Germany was never occupied. The German leaders understood that they were losing badly and that their military and their home front were on the verge of collapse. That's why they surrendered. But since Germany was never occupied, extremist politicians like Adolf Hitler would later claim that Germany had not really been defeated in World War I. They would claim that Germany only lost because of a stab in the back. That became the popular phrase. The stab in the back narrative claimed that unpatriotic forces in Germany undermined the German government and military and surrendered even though Germany had not been defeated. And who were these unpatriotic forces that double-crossed the fatherland? Since I mentioned Adolf Hitler, you could probably guess that the Nazis and the other people on the lunatic fringe blamed it on the Jews and communists. This stab-in-the-back fiction was presented to the German populace over and over in speeches by the Nazis, as well as periodicals, and all of the other media put out by Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. A large segment of the German population came to accept this nonsense as truth. Germany did not lose World War I. The German military was sold out by traitorous elements at home, meaning Jews and communists. This false narrative was one of the reasons why so many people supported the Nazis. This time, they would not be stabbed in the back by Jews and communists. This time, Germany would conquer all. Deutschland über alles. The leaders of the Western Allies understood this stab-in-the-back myth and how it helped lead to World War II. American and British leaders wanted to avoid a repeat of that same mistake. That is why they wanted to occupy Germany at the end of World War II. They did not want any future radical leaders to again claim that Germany had not really been defeated. When your country is occupied by foreign troops, it's hard to claim that you did not lose the war. And now for the reasons why unconditional surrender was a necessary policy. Number one, unconditional surrender was a good way to keep up the morale of the Western Allies. America, Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were and are functioning democracies. In democratic countries, leaders have to consider the will of the people. These governments were asking a lot of sacrifice from their citizens. They had to keep up the morale on the home front. You want people to keep fighting, meaning a lot of deaths and serious injuries. You have to convince people that it is a cause worth fighting for. When you tell your people that you are fighting to eliminate the Nazi regime and the militarist government of Japan, that is a clear-cut goal that most people in these Western democracies believed in. And it's not just the people in the military. You have to convince the citizens to keep buying war bonds and to keep working extra hours in the factories and to put up with all of the rationing and shortages of various foods and supplies. And in Britain, to put up with being bombed first by the Luftwaffe and then by the V-1 flying bombs and the V-2 rockets. Reason number two why unconditional surrender was a good policy. The Western Allies had to keep the Soviet Union fighting. Joseph Stalin was very suspicious of the close relationship between America and Britain. Of course, Stalin was very suspicious of everybody and everything. But Stalin really worried that the democracies might make a separate peace with the Nazis, and then everybody would turn on the Soviet Union. Before Hitler came along and threatened everybody, the Soviet Union was considered the big boogeyman. And rightly so. The USSR was a horrible police state. Nobody was a bigger anti-communist than Winston Churchill. But the Western Allies understood that Hitler was a much bigger threat at the time than Stalin and agreed to work with Stalin to defeat the Nazis. During the war, the Western Allies had to do whatever it took to keep the Soviets fighting. Why? Because during most of World War II, approximately 75 to 80% of the Wehrmacht, the German army, was on the Eastern Front fighting the Soviets. The Soviets suffered an estimated 27 million deaths in World War II. 27 million! In World War II, the United States suffered approximately 418,000 dead. That is a tremendous number. But the Soviet Union lost almost 65 times that amount. 65 times the number of Americans killed in World War II. The majority of the Wehrmacht was worn down on the Eastern Front versus the Soviets. This is why the British, and later the United States, were providing the USSR with enormous amounts of supplies to keep the Soviets in the war. By the end of the war, America sent its Soviet allies the following military equipment: 400,000 jeeps and trucks, 14,000 airplanes, 8,000 tractors, 13,000 tanks. In addition, the U.S. sent the Soviets the following supplies: more than 1.5 million blankets, 15 million pairs of army boots, 107,000 tons of cotton, 2.7 million tons of petroleum products to fuel airplanes, trucks, and tanks, 4.5 million tons of food. The U.S. even transported an entire Ford Company tire factory to the USSR, which made tires for military vehicles. Although I could not find the amounts, America also sent guns, ammunition, explosives, copper, steel, aluminum, medicine, field radios, radar tools, books, and countless other items. From 1941 through 1945, the U.S. sent $11.3 billion in goods to the Soviets. That would be worth approximately $188 billion in today's dollars. America also bankrolled the Allies in World War II. The U.S. was supplying these war materials for free. All of these supplies enabled the Soviets to keep fighting the Nazis, and the policy of unconditional surrender helped keep Stalin willing to suffer approximately 27 million dead by convincing him that the Western Allies would not abandon the USSR through a negotiated peace with Germany. Reason number 3 why unconditional surrender was the right policy is very similar to reason number 2. The Western Allies had to keep the Chinese in the war. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers were tied down on the Asian mainland fighting the Chinese, who refused to give up even though they were outmatched by the state-of-the-art Japanese military. It is estimated that the Chinese lost approximately 14 million dead in World War II. As I mentioned earlier, America lost approximately 418,000 dead. That means that the Chinese suffered over 33 times the amount of deaths as the United States. If the Chinese thought that the Western Allies might reach a peace settlement with Japan, wherein Japan kept some of the regions of China that they had conquered, the Chinese might not be willing to endure such incredible losses. That is why the Western Allies had to convince both the Chinese and the Soviets that there would be no negotiated peace. It would be unconditional surrender. Reason number 4 why unconditional surrender was the correct policy was the absolute necessity to completely eliminate Nazism. Does anybody think that we should have reached a settlement with the Nazi regime? There is no way that Hitler and his insane followers would have agreed to any type of settlement with the Nazis stepping down from power. This was the worst criminal government in the history of the world and had to be eliminated. This was for the benefit of everybody. If they were left in power, the Nazis would always constitute a threat to their neighbors and general world peace. Think about this. The United States developed atomic bombs during World War II. Shortly afterwards, the Soviet Union also developed nuclear weapons, and so did the United Kingdom and several other countries since then. Can you imagine a settlement that ended World War II and left the Nazis in power in Germany during the atomic age? Does anybody believe that Hitler, Goering, Himmler, or any of the other nuts in charge of Nazi Germany would have shied away from using nuclear weapons on their adversaries? Fortunately for humanity, we never had to face that question. And the elimination of the Nazi regime was also good for the German people. Hitler and his insane crew caused great hardship to their own people as well as the rest of the world. Reason number 5 why unconditional surrender was the appropriate policy was the necessity of reforming Japanese society. The Allies could not make a settlement with the militarist government of Japan. That entire regime had to go. Like the Nazis, they would always pose a threat to their neighbors, and that regime was also horrible for the Japanese people. Everybody knows what a horrendous regime the Nazis were, but sometimes the atrocities of the Japanese government of the 1930s and World War II are overlooked. I will not go into all of them here, but I will list 2 of the biggest ones. The first was the comfort women. That's such a nice euphemism instead of saying sex slaves. During World War II, Imperial Japan kidnapped women from the territories they occupied. From what I've read, it appears that the majority of these victims came from Korea. These women and young girls were provided as sex slaves to Japanese soldiers. For obvious reasons, the Japanese did not keep accurate records of these sex slaves. I have seen estimates ranging from 50,000, which seems very low, up to 400,000, which seems more likely to be accurate, women and girls kidnapped from their homes and repeatedly raped for years. Whatever the actual figure was, this was a true crime against humanity. The other big atrocity I want to address was a slaughter which has come to be known as the Rape of Nanking. The actual name of the city is Nanjing, but at the time it was known in English-speaking countries as Nanking, and this incident is still referred to as the Rape of Nanking. At the time, Nanjing was the capital of the Republic of China. In December 1937, the Japanese army captured the city of Nanjing. Once they had control of the city, the commanding officers allowed the Japanese soldiers to run wild, killing and raping civilians, including children. I have seen various estimates for the number of deaths. Generally, historians list the number of Chinese civilians killed in this rampage at somewhere around 200,000, but I've seen estimates as high as 300,000 deaths, along with tens of thousands of women and girls brutally raped by Japanese soldiers. There were plenty of other war crimes committed by the Japanese military during World War II. I just described these two as examples as to why unconditional surrender was necessary. The Western Allies could not make a negotiated settlement with a government that permitted these kind of atrocities. Reason number 6. Japan and Germany are both much better off because of unconditional surrender. After the war, Japan and Germany were occupied and completely transformed into capitalist democracies. I know what some of you are thinking. What about East Germany? Regrettably, East Germany was a puppet state of the Soviet Union up until 1989. But West Germany was flourishing soon after World War II. And since Germany was officially reunited, on October 3, 1990, the unified country of Germany has been an example of a thriving democracy. For many decades, Japan and Germany have had two of the best economies in the world, and their citizens have had much better lives with many more rights than they did under the old regimes. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were both police states. There are people who claim that unconditional surrender was a bad policy because it supposedly kept the Axis forces fighting until the bitter end. Not true. Let's discuss why the people of Germany fought until May 1945, when their country was occupied by the Allies and Hitler was dead. It wasn't the policy of unconditional surrender. It was the insane dictates of Adolf Hitler. He demanded that Germany fight up until the end. After D-Day, on June 6, 1944, when the Western Allies invaded France, it was clear to everybody that Germany was going to lose. They could have surrendered in the summer of 1944 before their country was destroyed, but Hitler made them fight on until most of Germany was annihilated. He did this because he was a megalomaniac and figured if he was going to die, he was taking down millions of people with him. As I explained earlier, in July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. This resulted in the ouster and arrest of Benito Mussolini. But this didn't happen to Hitler. As I say this, some of you are wondering, what about the Valkyrie plot of July 20, 1944? It is true that German Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators tried to blow up Hitler and overthrow the Nazi regime. But that was a small group which did not have widespread support. This was evidenced when, unfortunately for the world, Hitler survived the blast and the plot almost immediately collapsed. As a result, the German people followed Hitler to the bitter end and most of Germany was destroyed. Hitler wanted a scorched scorched earth policy. In August 1944, the American, British, and Canadian armies were approaching Paris when Hitler commanded the widest destruction possible of the city. A few days later, Hitler ordered German General Dietrich von Choltitz, the commander in the French capital, Paris must not fall into the hands of the enemy, or if it does, he must find there nothing but a field of ruins. Fortunately for humanity, the German commanding general in Paris did not carry out Hitler's orders and turned over an intact Paris to the Allies. And I'm sure you're thinking, that doesn't mean that Hitler wanted scorched earth for his beloved Germany. He did. In March of 1945, as Allied armies were closing in from the west as well as from the east, Hitler received a memorandum from his Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer. Speer told Hitler that the German economy could only last for another 4 to 8 weeks at the most. At that point, Germany could no longer continue to fight. Speer recommended that Hitler should take all possible steps for the survival of the German people. According to Speer, Hitler replied to him, "It is not necessary to worry about their," meaning the German people, "needs for elemental survival." Hitler felt that the German people had let him down and the future belongs entirely to the strong people of the East. Hitler issued a special decree on March 19, 1945 called Destructive Measures on Reich Territory. It is commonly known as the Scorched Earth Decree or the Nero Decree. Of course, that is in reference to Emperor Nero, who supposedly fiddled while Rome burned. By the way, that story is not true. Nero was the emperor of Rome from 54 CE until 68 CE. On July 18, 64 CE, a fire started in or near the Circus Maximus. That was that enormous stadium in Rome where they held the chariot races. The historian Publius Cornelius Tacitus, usually just called Tacitus, lived in the late 1st century and early 2nd century CE. According to Tacitus, the fire burned for 6 days. Fires were a big problem in ancient times. Even with the sophisticated water system that the Romans created, they didn't have fire hydrants. A large percentage of Rome burned. A rumor started that Nero started the fire, or even if he didn't start it, he did nothing to stop it. And worse, he enjoyed watching Rome burn. Hence the myth that Nero played the fiddle as he watched Rome burn. I don't think any modern historians believe Nero was to blame for the fire. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. He was in Antium, a coastal town about 40 miles or 65 kilometers away from Rome. Tacitus also states that when Nero returned to Rome, the fire was out of control, but the emperor opened up public buildings and even his own palace to the people who had lost their homes. Tacitus explains, "Yet his measures, popular as their character might be, failed of their effect, for the report had spread that, at the very moment when Rome was aflame, he had mounted his private stage and, typifying the ills of the present by the calamities of the past, had sung the destruction of Troy." I love the fact that I can look up online the writings of somebody like Tacitus from 2,000 years ago. I find it simply amazing. One last thing about Nero is his connection to the Roman Colosseum, which has to be one of the 3 or 4 most famous buildings in the world. No, he did not build it. The original name was actually the Amphitheatrum Flavium in Latin, or Flavian Amphitheater in English. It was called that because it was built between 70 CE and 80 CE by emperors of the Flavian dynasty. But how did it come to be called the Colosseum? Most people presume it's because it was so large that people thought the amphitheater was colossal. Nope. The name comes from a giant statue which was located near the entrance of the amphitheater. Supposedly, the statue was somewhere around 100 feet or 30 meters tall. The statue was made of bronze and depicted the Emperor Nero. The statue was known as the Colossus. At some point, the Romans transferred the name to the amphitheater and started calling it the Colosseum. The giant statue is long gone, but there is a marble inscription that marks the spot where the Colossus statue once stood. Okay, I realize I went way off topic, but I just love ancient Rome. And once I get going on something as interesting as Rome, it's hard to stop. Let's get back to Hitler's order known as the Nero Decree. Hitler ordered the demolition of all of Germany's infrastructure. Hitler directed the destruction of all utilities, bridges, railroads, communications, factories, docks, anything that could be useful to the Allies. Of course, all of this infrastructure was necessary for the basic existence of the German people. The point is that Hitler did not care about the citizens of Germany. He wanted as much death and destruction as he could cause, since it was clear he did not have much time to live. But why did the German people go along with this? A lot of this had to do with Hitler's mystique and popularity. Somehow the all-knowing and all-powerful Führer could still win the war with wonder weapons or some of his supposed genius. Hitler had such a hold on the German people and the Nazi hierarchy. Throughout the last year of the war, the brilliant but truly despicable propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels urged Germany to keep on fighting. However, he did not tell the Germans that they needed to keep on fighting because of unconditional surrender and what that might mean. I'm pointing out why the German government kept the policy of refusing to surrender until the bitter end. It had nothing to do with unconditional surrender. People who claim that unconditional surrender made Germany and Japan fight to the bitter end are wrong. I'll address the Japanese later on. As I just explained, the Nazi hierarchy kept fighting because they knew they had nothing to lose. They all knew that they would be executed if captured. But many individual Germans surrendered when they could. Millions of German soldiers surrendered long before VE Day. In case you're not familiar with that term, that means Victory in Europe Day, celebrated as May 8, 1945. This was especially true with Germans who were facing the Western Allies. They understood that they were much better off being prisoners of war to the Americans, British, and Canadians than being captured by the Soviets. The point is that the Allies never altered their positions, yet millions of German soldiers surrendered even though the Allied policy remained unconditional surrender. Let's discuss if the Japanese continued to fight because of the Allied policy of unconditional surrender. The answer is no. They continued fighting because of the Japanese mindset of honor and shame. They believed in Bushido. That was the moral code of the samurai during feudal Japan. It promoted the importance of loyalty and honor, and most important, not fearing death and dying for valor. A case in point is the Battle of Tarawa. That's an island in the Gilbert Islands located in the Central Pacific. It was a Japanese outpost. The U.S. invaded in November 1943. The Japanese had approximately 4,400 soldiers defending the island. Only 17 were captured alive. That is 1/3 of 1%. Think about that. Only 17 were captured alive out of 4,400. The rest fought to the death. This was not an isolated incident. In most battles between Americans and Japanese in World War II, the majority of the Japanese fought to the death rather than being captured. The individual Japanese soldiers did not fight to the death because of some grand strategy by the Japanese High Command to avoid unconditional surrender. Individual soldiers fought to the death to avoid the shame of surrender. It was considered a sense of honor to refuse to surrender. As I explained earlier, Japanese soldiers believed in Bushido, which valued honor above life itself. That's why individuals fought to the death rather than surrender. On islands like Guadalcanal, when Japanese soldiers ran out of ammunition, they didn't surrender. Instead, they did banzai charges. They fixed bayonets to their rifles and charged the American lines. They knew they would be slaughtered, just mowed down by American fire, but they would rather do that than be captured. And it wasn't just soldiers. A lot of Japanese civilians also felt this way. This was demonstrated in the last big battle of the Pacific War, Okinawa. American forces invaded the island of Okinawa on April 1, 1945. The battle dragged on until late June 1945. Over 100 100,000 civilians on Okinawa are estimated to have died during the battle, some as casualties of war and some by suicide. I cannot find any accurate figures as to the number of civilian suicides in Okinawa, but it was certainly a significant number. And it wasn't just the people of Okinawa. In the summer of 1944, U.S. forces invaded Saipan in the Mariana Islands. There are videos of women on Saipan jumping off of a cliff. They would rather kill themselves rather than be captured. And some killed their kids before killing themselves. Of course, when talking about the Japanese preference for suicide, the best example were the kamikaze pilots. These were the pilots who crashed their planes into the American naval ships. Where did they come up with that name? Kamikaze means divine wind. The term referenced typhoons that dispersed Mongol fleets in the 1200s that were trying to invade Japan. The kamikaze planes were filled with explosives. The men flying these planes had very little training. They didn't need a lot of instruction. These were one-way flights. Starting in October 1944, kamikazes were flying into American ships. The point of all of these examples is that the Japanese usually chose a supposedly honorable death over the shame of surrender. Now for a related issue. Some people argue that the only condition necessary for a negotiated peace was modifying unconditional surrender and advising the Japanese that they could keep the emperor. I have three arguments against that. Argument A. The people who make this claim always place all the blame on the United States for not making this offer to the Japanese. What about the Japanese themselves? The Japanese could have said that they would surrender if they could keep the emperor. But the Japanese never made an offer to the U.S. that they would be willing to surrender provided they could keep the emperor until after the 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japan and the Soviets had already attacked the Japanese army on the Asian mainland. Before the catastrophic events of mid-August 1945, the Japanese were not willing to surrender under any circumstances. If before the 2 atomic bombs and the Soviet Union's entry into the war, the Japanese were willing to end the war upon an assurance that the emperor would remain in place, the Japanese government could have said so, but they didn't. The Japanese were trying to negotiate with the Americans using the neutral governments of Sweden and Switzerland. But prior to August 12, 1945, the Japanese did not offer to surrender on the sole condition of keeping their emperor because they had not reached that point. Prior to the atomic bombs and the entry of the Red Army, the Japanese were not willing to give up all of their territorial gains or to have their entire society remodeled even if they could keep the emperor. Argument B, against people who claim that the only condition necessary for a negotiated peace was advising the Japanese that they could keep the emperor. There had to be an occupation of Japan and a complete overhaul of their entire society from top to bottom. There is no way that the Japanese would have agreed to that. As I explained earlier, the Japanese are much better off under the new constitution after World War II, and the world is better off with a thriving and stable Japanese democracy. Argument C. There is no evidence that the Japanese were willing to surrender on the condition that Emperor Hirohito was allowed to remain as simply a ceremonial figure like the British king or queen. To be clear, that is what happened to the position of the emperor after the American occupation started in September 1945. But when the Japanese were talking about keeping their emperor, they meant they wanted to keep the imperial system. They wanted to keep their system of government and their social structure. This meant the political system, which led to the enormous war which resulted in the approximately 25 million deaths in Asia and the Pacific, as well as the war crimes and atrocities I referenced earlier. The United States and its allies would have been crazy to agree to such conditions. People who make this claim that the U.S. should have told the Japanese that they could keep their emperor, meaning the imperial system, never consider these points. Let's discuss Emperor Hirohito. He became emperor in 1926 at the age of 25. He was considered a living god by the Japanese people. He was as guilty of war crimes as Hideki Tojo and the other government and military leaders. And as I say the name Hideki Tojo, some of you might be thinking that I'm saying it backwards. It is true that in Japanese culture, the family name is said first, meaning Tojo, and then the individual name is said second, meaning Hideki. But in English-speaking countries, we say the individual's name first and then the family name second, so it is customary in English to do so even with Japanese names, and that's why we say Hideki Tojo instead of Tojo Hideki. Hirohito was not only head of the government, but also the commander-in-chief of the Japanese armed forces. He may not have planned the invasions of China, the Philippines, the British, Dutch, and French colonies, or the attack on Pearl Harbor, but Hirohito was presented with all of these proposed military acts of aggression and approved them before they were carried out. He was given reports from the Army and the Navy and sanctioned all of their actions. Simply stated, he authorized these invasions and surprise attacks. By consenting to these actions, Hirohito was just as guilty as the military and civilian leaders who started and expanded the enormous Asian and Pacific War. Some people argue that Hirohito could not have stopped the war in Asia and the Pacific or prevented it from expanding as it did. Of course he could have stopped it. We have the evidence from August 1945. After the 2 atomic bombs were dropped by America and the Soviet Union entered the war, Hirohito finally stepped forward and told the government that the war must end. And he famously recorded a speech which was broadcast throughout the country telling the Japanese that they had surrendered. This shows 2 things. First is that Hirohito always had the power to stop the war. Second is that he did not act in the best interests of his subjects. By the summer of 1942, the war had already turned against Japan. With each passing year, it was clearer and clearer that Japan would lose. But Hirohito did not stop the war. Most telling is when the American firebombing campaign started in early 1945. On March 9 and 10, 1945, 334 B-29 bombers took off from air bases in the Mariana Islands headed for Tokyo. Those planes dropped 1,667 tons of napalm-filled incendiary bombs on the Japanese capital. We don't have exact numbers, but somewhere over 100,000 people were killed in that one bombing raid. This was the highest death toll of any air raid during World War II. That one firebombing raid of Tokyo in March 1945 killed more people than either of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. As a comparison, the bombing of Dresden, Germany a month earlier had resulted in around 25,000 deaths. The firebombing of Tokyo that night destroyed 16 square miles or 41 square kilometers of the city. It is also estimated that approximately 1 million people were rendered homeless. This firestorm in Tokyo was truly hell on earth. Consider these conditions in Tokyo during the firestorm of March 10, 1945. Temperatures reached an incomprehensible 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit or 980 degrees Celsius in some locations. The intense fires sucked the oxygen out of the air, asphyxiating those people who did not simply burn to death. The clothes people were wearing literally burst into flames from the heat. Glass and windows began to liquefy. Cyclonic winds from the firestorm blew the liquefied glass all around, where it fell on people like a literal rain of fire. And what I just described was just one raid on one city. American planes firebombed more than 60 Japanese cities in 1945, killing hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. The point of all this is that Hirohito could and should have stopped the war long before August 1945. A monarch who truly had the best interests of his people in mind would have stopped the war as soon as this firebombing campaign began. But Hirohito allowed it to continue and allowed the American military to destroy most of the Japanese home islands. After the war, Hirohito was allowed to remain as the emperor, but his power and position were changed. He was no longer a living god and was no longer commander-in-chief of the military or head of the government. The Japanese emperor was now a ceremonial post like the king or queen of the United Kingdom. Instead of being tried as a war criminal, Hirohito got to live out the rest of his life in luxury until he died of cancer in 1989 at the age of 87. Now let's talk about the Nuremberg trials. Nazi leaders were tried by a military tribunal constituted by the Allies in the city of Nuremberg, Germany, after World War II. Nuremberg was a great choice for the location of these trials. It was the city where the Nazis used to hold their insane annual party rallies. It was also the city where, in 1935, the Nazis issued their anti-Jewish regulations, which came to be known as the Nuremberg race laws. The Nuremberg trials were held between November 20, 1945, and October 1, 1946. The comprehensive evidence created a thorough record of most of the Nazi regime's worst crimes. Final verdicts were announced on October 1, 1946. 3 of the defendants were acquitted. 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death, and the rest received sentences between 10 years to life in prison. On October 16, 1946, 10 former Nazi officials were hanged in Nuremberg after being convicted of crimes against humanity. And some of you are thinking, didn't he just say that there were 10 Nazis hanged, but there were 12 sentenced to death? That is correct. The reason there were only 10 hangings out of 12 death sentences was because Nazi Party Secretary Martin Bormann was tried in absentia. It was believed he was still alive. However, a DNA test in 1998 confirmed that Bormann had died in Berlin at the end of the war. The other condemned prisoner who was not hanged was Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, a despicable human being who was the number 2 man in Nazi Germany behind Adolf Hitler. He committed suicide the night before he was scheduled to be hanged. For 59 years, there was a mystery as to how Goering got the cyanide. But in 2005, a former American prison guard named Herbert Lee Stivers told the Los Angeles Times newspaper that a young German woman named Mona had fooled Stivers into smuggling a vial of liquid into Goering's cell hidden in a fountain pen, telling Stivers that it was medicine. Is this story true? Who knows, but I would say it probably is. For some reason, the Tokyo trials are not nearly as famous as the Nuremberg trials. Those were the trials of the Japanese war criminals from May 1946 to November 1948. The results of the Tokyo trials were 7 defendants sentenced to death by hanging and 16 defendants sentenced to life imprisonment. Hideki Tojo was one of the people condemned to death. Besides being a general in the Imperial Japanese Army, he was the Prime Minister of Japan during most of World War II from October 1941 to July 1944. Tojo was executed by hanging on December 23, 1948. His execution is kind of a weird story. Tojo tried to kill himself rather than be captured. As American personnel went to arrest him on September 8, 1945, he shot himself in the chest. He missed his heart. The gunshot did not kill him, and American doctors made sure that he recovered. I know that the point was that they wanted Tojo to stand trial, but I've always found it very odd to make a big effort to save somebody from an attempted suicide just so you could hang him later on. Emperor Hirohito was not one of the defendants in the Tokyo trials. As I explained earlier, he was certainly guilty of war crimes. So why wasn't he a defendant, and why was he allowed to remain as emperor? It was because of the Supreme Commander of the Allied occupation of Japan, Douglas MacArthur. If you listen to my episode entitled Douglas MacArthur is the most overrated general in U.S. history, you know that I do not think much of Douglas MacArthur as a general. However, he did an excellent job during the occupation of Japan. MacArthur and other American officials realized that Hirohito would be very valuable for the occupation and the reconstitution of Japanese society. There was concern among high-level Americans that if they tried Hirohito as a war criminal, it might cause a lot of unrest with Japanese civilians who considered this man as a living god. Conversely, keeping Hirohito as the emperor, even though he no longer had any actual power, helped to pacify the Japanese people during the American occupation. So Hirohito was allowed to remain as emperor until he died of cancer in 1989 at the age of 87. As I outlined earlier, the majority of individual Japanese kept fighting not because of any policies issued by the Allies, but because of the Bushido Code and their willingness to accept death rather than dishonor. But what about the Japanese government? They understood that unconditional surrender did not mean the extermination of the Japanese people. On July 26, 1945, a declaration was issued by American President Harry Truman, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalist forces in China. You might be wondering, why was Stalin not part of this declaration? It's because, at that time, the Soviet Union was not yet at war with Japan. This proclamation is commonly known as the Potsdam Declaration. Although it confirmed the policy of unconditional surrender, the Potsdam Declaration stated that the Allies were not out to punish the Japanese people as set forth in the following language. We do not intend that the Japanese shall be enslaved as a race or destroyed as a nation, but stern justice shall be meted out to all war criminals, including those who have visited cruelties upon our prisoners. The Japanese government shall remove all obstacles to the revival and strengthening of democratic tendencies among the Japanese people, freedom of speech, of religion, and of thought, as well as a respect for the fundamental human rights shall be established. The allegation that the Japanese government refused to surrender because the Allies wanted to annihilate Japan is simply wrong. The Potsdam Declaration set forth stern but reasonable terms. The Potsdam Declaration also pointed out what would happen if the Japanese did not surrender, wherein it stated, "The result of the futile and senseless German resistance to the might of the aroused free peoples of the world stands forth in awful clarity as an example to the people of Japan. The might that now converges on Japan is immeasurably greater than that which, when applied to the resisting Nazis, necessarily laid waste to the lands, the industry, and the method of life of the whole German people. The full application of our military power, backed by our resolve, will mean the inevitable and complete destruction of the Japanese armed forces and just as inevitably the utter destruction of the Japanese homeland." There was no rational reason for the government of Japan to continue the war, but military and government leaders believed that it was better to fight to the death of the very last Japanese rather than suffer the humiliation of surrender. This was exemplified just before the actual surrender. The Supreme Council of Japan consisted of 6 members. In a meeting of the Supreme Council in August 1945, after America dropped the 2 atomic bombs and the Soviets had entered the war, Emperor Hirohito had to break the deadlock of 3 members of the Supreme Council voting to surrender and 3 members voting to continue fighting. This was after the 2 atomic bombs which completely destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and after the Soviet Union had entered the war, and after American planes had firebombed most of the cities of Japan for more than half a year. With the country on the verge of starvation and complete destruction, half of the Supreme Council still wanted to fight on. This shows the mindset of the Japanese leaders. Prior to August 1945, the Japanese would only accept a negotiated peace, but such a settlement included conditions that the Allies would never accept, like 1. The Japanese home islands would not be occupied by the Allies. 2. Allowing Japan to keep some of the regions it had conquered during the war. 3. Japan would try its own war criminals. Obviously, the Allies were not going to agree to such ridiculous terms. When people argue that a particular policy was bad, they often don't consider the alternatives. As I have outlined in this episode, there were many benefits to unconditional surrender. And just as important, there were no reasonable alternatives which would have been better for the Allies or even the Germans and Japanese or the world at large. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. If you are listening on a podcast app which allows ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Reviews really help. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, it's easy to do. Scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, hopefully 5 stars, and then tap Write a Review. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links for fun items for all the history geeks. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.